I just got my lawsuit final statement from the judge, and I'm going to read it. It was dated January 15th, 2020. Okay, so in Eng versus Sunny Seaside LLC et al., which Soptoshi Penn, I really want that to be included, Clatsop County court case. Dear parties, this matter came before the court for trial on October 15th, 2019, and then resumed on October 31, which was rescheduled to November 11th, on plaintiff's complaint seeking damages, lost wages, and costs incurred while she was a tenant at plaintiff's rental property in Seaside, Oregon. Plaintiff also seeks to clear her record. Defendant had denied the claim and filed a counterclaim seeking damages for lost rent and costs incurred. The court received the testimony of the parties, received photographs and exhibits, then took this matter under advisement. I have now reviewed the exhibits and have considered the arguments of the parties. Timeline of relevant events, summarized from exhibits. Defendant Mr. Akbar purchased the rental property at 430 South Holiday Drive, Seaside, Oregon, July 2018. There are 12 rental units. In January of 2019, plaintiff Ms. Eng and her co-tenant GK entered into a rental agreement with defendant to begin in February of 2019. The rent for Unit 6, taken as is, was $850 per month and a $900 deposit. Defendant's Exhibit 113. Plaintiff paid the security deposit and paid rent of $850 for the months of February, March, April 2019. On March 10, 2019, plaintiff corresponded by email with defendant summarizing the confrontation and other problems she was having with her downstairs neighbor Mark. Which, it's like, no, he was harassing us. It wasn't me having a confrontation. April 2019, on or about April 7, 2019, defendant asked plaintiff to provide fill-in duties while the property manager, Leslie Vipon, quit and moved. Plaintiff stated she felt coerced to accept the position, and for the next few weeks, she answered many calls and texts per day. She also communicated frequently with defendant, downloading specialized software, checked for keys, provided additional cleaning, and had her personal information available for tenants to use. She also believed it was her duty to report violations and thought that defendant would appreciate her diligence. Defendant adamantly denies that he hired plaintiff to be his property manager. By way of example, he submitted his property management and maintenance agreements he used with his manager, Leslie Vipond, and later with his property manager, Severiano Ramos. These agreements outlined the duties and expectations of the property manager in detail. On April 11, 2019, plaintiff sent an email to defendant complaining about the need to enter another tenant's unit to flip the circuit breaker. She said she had to do this multiple times per day because even the slightest use of power in her unit would cause an outage. She also complained about the threatening comments she received from Robert Bob Dunnigan and mentioned some of his illegal practices regarding the disposal of waste and non-permitted work. She explained her concern of fire and mold and asked defendant to use licensed contractors to provide services. On April 11, 2019, plaintiff contacted the Seaside Police Department and made a report of bad building practices, which it was not actually. That was just a side note to the harassment from Dunnigan, but that's just okay. Anyway, it appears that the police contacted Bob Dunnigan and no further action was taken. At that time, on April 12, 2019, Tim Samples, chief electrical inspector for Clatsop County, drafted a memorandum to Bob Mitchell, Director of Building and Code Enforcement, for the City of Seaside, summarizing his inspection of the premises at 430 South Holiday upon receiving a complaint. Mr. Samples' goal was to determine whether the electrical violations were serious enough to warrant a disconnection of the electricity. He inspected Unit 6, plaintiff's unit, the laundry, and the exterior. Although other units were subject of complaints, Mr. Samples was not provided access to them. Regardless, he found 5 violations. The first 2 did not arise to a level of imminent threat. He found that the third violation was due to the overloaded outlets in Unit 6 because the tenant, plaintiff, was using extension cords and splitters. Mr. Samples advised plaintiff that the overloaded outlets were the cause of the circuit breakers tripping. He found a 4th potential violation which required a separate meter for each dwelling unit. The 5th potential violation required tenants to have access to the circuit breakers that provide electricity to their units. It should be noted that the breaker box for Unit 6 was located in another apartment. An exception for access requirement exists where there is an on-site building manager who has access to reset a breaker 24 hours a day. Because none of the 5 violations rose to the level of imminent threat, Mr. Samples did not recommend shutting off the electricity so long as the owner repaired the violations. He cautioned, however, that he did not inspect the other units where other complaints were identified. April 13th, 2019, defendant sent a notice from landlord to all tenants stating that Leslie Vipon was no longer serving for your property. He indicated that he was looking for a new property manager and maintenance person, and that until a new manager was in place, plaintiff has been temporarily assigned to take tenant calls. The prior manager's phone was given to plaintiff for this purpose. Plaintiff testifies to her belief that she was being offered the job at $360 a month. She said the rate of pay was too attractive to pass up. She believes she accepted defendant's offer to be the interim property manager on or about April 12, 2019. April 15, 2019, Director Bob Mitchell wrote a letter to the defendant in response to a citizen complaint about the property. Plaintiff was the complainant. An inspection ensued and substandard conditions were noted related to the structure of the premises, which were detrimental to the public's health, safety, and welfare. The property was declared a public nuisance. The letter outlined the substandard conditions, which included plumbing and electrical concerns, needed immediate attention and abatement schedule. The April 12, 2019 letter from Tim Samples, Chief Electrical Inspector for Clatsop County, was enclosed with Mr. Mitchell's letter to defendant. Plaintiff's Exhibits 3 and 4, Defendant's Exhibit 108. On April 17, 2019, Mr. Samples wrote a letter to defendant identifying 5 code violations and assessing the level of threat. The letter was similar to the previous letter sent to Mr. Mitchell on April 12, 2019. Violation 3 concerned the overloaded outlets in Plaintiff's Unit 6, which were due to her use of extension cords and splitters. Out of the 5 violations observed, none of them rose to the level of imminent threat, requiring a disconnection of power. Mr. Samples asked defendant to provide a schedule of repairs. He also sought permission to inspect all units. On April 20th, 2019, defendant sent an email to plaintiff with a 10-day eviction notice attached. The referenced lease termination notice alleged extremely outrageous acts by placing other tenants at risk by overloading the electrical circuits as the basis for the eviction. It appears, however, that the plaintiff and defendant later came up with a plan to allow plaintiff to be released from the lease and be allowed to stay at the apartment until she found another place. Plaintiff testified that defendant told her she could stay through May and would be considering her allowing her to stay longer. Plaintiff's email exhibits and defendant's exhibits 117 and 118. On or between April 22 and May 29, 2019, defendant engaged in numerous communications with Bob Mitchell and Tim Samples regarding the schedule for needed repairs. Defendant was reminded by Mr. Samples that the premises had a history of code violations and that continued progress on the repairs would be required. The plan was to review all of the apartments. Defendant was cooperative and communicated his willingness to work with them to the city. On April 23, 2019, plaintiff submitted a complaint referral form to an internet crime complaint center. She complained that the defendant induced her to pay rent and fees through Zelle as a part of a corporate scam to evade tax and housing laws. It is not clear if there was a further investigation to her complaint. In a series of texts or emails between plaintiff and defendant from April 19 through April 23, 2019, defendant makes clear that he did not hire plaintiff or offer her any money. He also reiterates an apparent agreement that plaintiff will leave the apartment at the end of April 2019. Note, this is contrary to plaintiff's belief that she could stay through May. On April 25th, 2019, plaintiff sent an email to the Bureau of Labor Industries to report defendant's refusal to pay wage to property manager of nuisance building. Plaintiff represented that on April 7, 2019, she was asked by her landlord to fill in for the manager at the 12-unit property. She represented her pay was to be $350 a month plus an additional sum for sweeping and taking garbage to the curb. She summarized her complaints about the code violations and said she was threatened with violence and experienced retaliation when she was just trying to help. May 2019, on May 5th, 2019, defendant noted that the tenants, Sean Raffington, was to be hired as the new property manager. May 6, 2019, plaintiff sent an email to Sean Raffington summarizing the dispute she was having with the defendant over the conditions of the premises. She indicated that she and defendant had communicated about releasing her from the lease so long as she would move out. On May 13, 2019, defendant, through his property manager, Sean Raffington, filed a residential eviction complaint in Clatsop County Circuit Court case number. The allegation was non-payment of rent. The first appearance was scheduled on May 22, 2019. On or between May 13th and May 24, 2019, defendant had text or email communication with another tenant. He asks her not to let herself be influenced by plaintiff. He asks her not to let plaintiff enter her apartment to flip the circuit breaker due to his concern about fire. The communication between them turns sour, and it appears this tenant vacates the premises due to her own concerns for safety. Defendant testified he did not go after her for breaking her lease. On May 14, 2019, defendant provided a negative landlord reference to the Clatsop County Housing Authority, which appeared to be contrary to the reference provided by Sean Raffington. On May 17, 2019, the other tenant files a complaint to the city of Seaside alleging fire coming out of her sockets and other hazards in her apartment. On May 18, 2019, plaintiff corresponded via email with Sean Raffington about a prior contact with the fire marshal March 26, 2019. She provided copies of her email communication with Chief Dugan at the Seaside Fire Department. She had previously provided a copy of the lease for Unit 6, which explained the need to enter into another's apartment to flip the breaker box. Plaintiff acknowledged a discussion about the refrigerator using too much electricity for the circuit and the possible misuse of extension cords. May 22, 2019, Mr. Raffington sent a letter to the court requesting dismissal of the eviction complaint due to the tenant and I coming to an agreement on the unpaid rent. Mr. Raffington did not provide to the court any details of their agreement. Plaintiff testified that she believed the complaint contained perjured documents. She believes the efforts to evict her were in direct retaliation for her complaints. She took offense to defendant's statement that she go be a nun, which plaintiff inferred to be defendant's suggestion that she play along and hide issues. Between May 5 and May 31, 2019, defendant communicated with Sean Raffington via email about the electrical repairs, potential plumbing issues, and the status of the eviction against plaintiff. In his email communication, Sean Raffington explained that he could not go through with the eviction of plaintiff due to the unsafe apartment she and other tenants were living in. In the communication, defendant expressed his frustration that complaints were not being brought to his attention and that Sean Raffington was taking action regarding the property without defendant's knowledge. On May 23, 2019, plaintiff corresponded via email with Sean Raffington about the status of leaks in the apartment below her apartment. On May 24, plaintiff filed a second eviction complaint against plaintiff in case Mr. Akbar signed the complaint alleging non-payment of rent. The first appearance was scheduled for June 3rd. May 25th, plaintiff corresponded via email with Leslie Vipon expressing complaints about the leaking shower and other problems. On May 28th, defendant sent an email to Director Bob Mitchell confirming an early conversation and asking him to forward all current and future complaints received by the city regarding the property directly to him. On May 31, 2019, plaintiff filed a citizen's report and request for action with the city of Seaside. She complained that despite the ruling of the premises as a nuisance, the landlord had done nothing to stop the sewage smell permeating our units and across the street. She complained about other conditions as well, including fire hazards, black mold, leaky ceilings, standing water, sewer contamination, and rats. She expressed her concern for retaliation due to her reporting these matters to the city officials. June 2019. On June 3rd, 2019, plaintiff appeared before the court for a first appearance. Mr. Akbar appeared in person. Plaintiff answered through her attorney, Scott Staub. On behalf of plaintiff, Mr. Staub filed an answer denying the complaint and asserting numerous defenses. On June 7, 2019, the court assigned a general judgment of dismissal about the case based on the parties' stipulation. The parties did not provide to the court and details of their stipulation. On or about June 10, 2019, plaintiff had moved everything out of the apartment. Mr. Severino was now the new property manager of the apartments. Plaintiff testified that defendant never did a walkthrough with her and that she was actually fearful to meet with him. Plaintiff states that she was locked out of the complex at this point and argues that she should not be obligated to pay rent for June or July. July 2019. On or about July 3rd, 2019, defendant received a cease and desist extortion correspondence from a California attorney writing on behalf of plaintiff. The correspondence was related to a series of inflammatory internet posts written by plaintiff. Conclusions. As reflected above, some of plaintiff's complaints were founded by the inspectors, others were not. However, it is somewhat disingenuous of defendant to now seek rent for May, June, and July when it is determined that there were safety and habitability concerns and that complaints for non-payment of rent were dismissed. The 2 complaints were dismissed both by agreement and stipulations between the parties. Even though defendant testified that she believed her wages and security deposit would go toward any rent due for May, the term detailing the agreements between the parties were not provided, so it is now very difficult to piece together what the parties intended. The bottom line is that both complaints for non-payment were dismissed and plaintiff moved out, which the court assumes was the intended goal. Accordingly, I am not inclined to revisit the issue of back rent or return of the security deposit. Regarding plaintiff's claim for wages, it is clear from evidence that defendant temporarily relied on plaintiff to field complaints from the tenants. Plaintiff was hyper-vigilant in what she perceived to be her role, which ultimately created a lot of challenges for the defendant and those living at the premises. To plaintiff's credit, she brought several legitimate concerns to light, which it appears defendant has ameliorated. During the short gap between managers, it would have been reasonable to offer plaintiff some sort of gratuity or discount for any services provided, but there's no reliable evidence that plaintiff was intended to be or was employed as defendant's property manager. Given the documented problems with the building, although carried to the extreme, plaintiff's complaints to city authorities prompted needed repairs to the premises. Although repairs have been made and defendant is working with the city officials to keep the property in compliance, plaintiff has not stopped there. If defendant engaged in retaliatory actions by seeking the eviction, plaintiff also engaged in retaliatory actions by launching a malicious internet campaign against defendant and his business. These actions were extreme and unnecessary, negating any claim plaintiff might otherwise have for some sort of equitable money award. In sum, the tenancy was mishandled by both the landlord and the tenant. The parties took appropriate steps by ending it. I decline to award damages or costs to either party or for plaintiff's claim or defendant's counterclaim. This case shall be dismissed. Sincerely, Cindee S. Matyas, Circuit Court Judge. Go over that again. One more time. Malicious internet campaign. So evidently when I was researching freedom of speech law, malice is a standard for libel. But the thing about libel is stuff that's not true. So telling an untruth with malice is a higher level of problem than telling an untruth by accident. So how can you maliciously state the truth? Malicious, I'm not being accused of defamation or libel because the things that I've stated are true. So I'm a malicious truth teller, basically. On the extreme and unnecessary, so blogging is extreme and unnecessary in Clatsop County. Wrap that around your heads, people.